But one of the things I've learned and that I often say is if you want to love humanity, you're going to have to drastically lower your expectations. I think it's important to love humanity, but there's no point loving humanity based on a fairy tale. The darkness that we're seeing now was waiting there to be exploited by Trump and by the deeply corrupt Republican Congress and his hangers-on in his administration and some media outlets. But it's not, Trump didn't create it, as you say. And even though it's mostly Republicans who are doing this, and there is something very deeply wrong with the Republican Party right now, I would say. It's not because they're Republicans. It's not because they're any kind of person. It's not because they're white men. It's, just like, if a black person is a criminal, it's not because they're black. It's because it's human nature.
I'm Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. If there's one area of human endeavor that I have lost all hope or even hopium, and I've landed in bitterness, resignation, and despair, it's in the area of politics. Let's listen to Spencer Critchley as he shares from his extensive experience that there is actually a heart available in the human experience of politics. Yeah, this is going to take some real wrestling. And so please help me welcome Spencer Critchley. Hi there. Welcome to another round of the Poetry of Predicament podcast. I'm really looking forward to this particular conversation because I really get to pick the brain, so to speak, of someone who's, in my way of talking about Spencer Critchley, who is a political communications consultant, and I'm sure he can put more words on it and more description on what he's done in various political campaigns in the past few years. I keep myself as far from the political realm as I can, and I've found it very, very difficult to feel inspired and to even be clear what's going on. And I know I'm not alone. And I find myself just thankful that I can touch in with somebody who is a bit more directly connected. And I know that some of what he's going to be sharing, because I've had a chance to listen to a few of his earlier interviews and also touch in on the first few pages of his book. And Spencer, it's really great to have you here. As I just mentioned to the viewers, I'm just really resigned in terms of the political situation in our world, and I've never seen anything like what's occurred this year, and that's on top of. I'm just going to give you a little brief tour of just how deep my cynicism goes. And I don't at all mean to dump this in your lap, but I just want to give you a sense of it's rough over here. Before 2020 and the onset of COVID and the social justice issues that have so inflamed, not to mention the fires, which have also inflamed this year, we're in trouble. By any measure. And this is on top of years now when Trump was initially elected. I was already deeply cynical at that point because in my view, the whole Obama presidency was just a continuation of George W. Bush's presidency. I think Obama was the best Republican president we've ever had, and yay that. At least there was civility and charisma and so on. So you can get a sense of, I've really had a long and very cynical and resigned track with regard to politics. and what I'm especially looking forward to hearing from you and talking with you about is you've in your book, Patriots of Two Nations, is you seem to have taken some time and really looked through this political framing. How did we get so split in this country, and how has it been so dramatic? And so what got us here? So I know that this must be familiar territory for you to, given your book and many earlier interviews, but if you wouldn't mind just giving us just a brief sense of what kind of work you've been doing to give you this kind of information and this kind of perspective. And then give us a
Sure.
little bit about where did this split that we're so, pained by in this country right now, where did it come from? So Spencer, welcome. Thanks so much for being here.
Sure. Yeah, maybe I'll just give you a one sentence capsule of why it's called Patriots of Two Nations, and then I think my background can work us back to that
Great
subject matter. So it's called Patriots of Two Nations because my argument in the book is that we've actually been divided since the founding. It's been two nations living within two fundamentally different worldviews, occupying one territory. And I lay that out in the book and also offer a way forward, believe it or not, as serious as I think the current situation is. And actually, my life kind of led up to the writing of that book. I didn't know that's what was going to happen. But these two worldviews I describe are descended from the Enlightenment and the counter-Enlightenment, the Enlightenment being the triumph of reason in the 1700s, which was the basis for the founding of the United States. And the counter-Enlightenment was a resistance movement to that, basically, which rejected the idea that reason should be the ultimate authority and the ultimate arbiter of truth, and insisted that we should preserve faith and tradition and culture and ethnic identity and ties to the land. My own life actually kind of expresses the same kind of divide and attempt to unite those two worldviews. My first career was as a musician and composer and producer in the music business. I started out as a guitar player, like a lot of young people did, and then I became a professional musician and a songwriter, and as I say, began to produce both my own music and other people's music. And one thing led to another, and I ended up working in a series of different forms of media. I was writing music for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. I was living in Toronto at the time, and that led to entertainment journalism. They started asking me to interview other musicians because they figured here was a musician who seemed to also to be reasonably fluent in the English language, and maybe he can get some sense out of these rock musicians we're interviewing.
Yeah.
Anyway, so that led to journalism and trying to compress all of this. At one point, I went to Silicon Valley when this was in the early 90s, when I realized which way technology was going, and I thought that's where the future was going to be. So I worked in Silicon Valley in a variety of interactive media formats, including computer games and interactive TV and the web, for about 10 years. And then I got involved in politics in the 2004 campaign. I was so disturbed by the possibility that George W. Bush might be reelected. Imagine that. I mean, he looks, frankly, as bad as that was, he looks so good compared to what we have now. I volunteered with our local Democratic Party, giving them communications advice. And that led to professional work in politics as our local member of Congress and somebody running for mayor, and various people started asking if I could work on their campaigns. And then that eventually led to working on both of Barack Obama's presidential campaigns. And I helped a little bit on Hillary Clinton's campaign as well. And it was really the election night in 2016. I was in Phoenix, Arizona, with the Clinton campaign, the Hillary Clinton campaign, having just joined up because I was worried about how it was going. And Arizona was a battleground state. And like quite a few other campaign veterans who had been sitting that one out because we assumed she was a shoo-in, how could she possibly lose to this guy? But we got a little nervous, and a bunch of us started calling friends who were working on the campaign, saying, could you use some help? And I helped a little in the Michigan primary when she lost to Bernie Sanders, and then in the closing days of the general election campaign, I was in Arizona helping out with whatever I could do there. And when they called it for Trump, like a lot of people, I was just utterly shocked. And I set about trying to explain to myself, first of all, how this could have happened. Starting with an article I wrote for the Huffington Post called A Letter to a Friend Who Voted for Trump. And this was a letter, I didn't name the person I had in mind, but I was imagining writing to him, asking him, as somebody who I knew was a good person, I mean, really a very good person, and deeply patriotic, and yet who I knew had voted for Trump, and I could not imagine why. And that sort of started this process of thinking, which led to more thinking, which led to a lot of historical research. And I really just in the last year, it came together for me. In early 2020 is when I suddenly thought, oh, I think I see it. And the book just poured out of me. And it's based on this idea of the two nations, which are living within two fundamentally different worldviews. And as I say, those two nations are kind of in my head as well, because I started out my life as a musician and artist thinking in a very, what I would now call counter-enlightenment mode, even though I was also very logical and very interested in science and language and the Enlightenment worldview. I was also very much connected to the counter-enlightenment way of looking at things, which is far more intuitive and subjective and emotional. And here we are now. The book is my attempt to help explain to people how the folks who support Trump, many of them are living within this counter-enlightenment worldview. And those of us who oppose him are very much dominated by the Enlightenment worldview. And one of the paths forward is to learn how to think and exist in both of those worldviews.
Mm. You know, I thank you for that recap, and I appreciate it. And just a quick question about that letter to the anonymous friend. I'm curious, is that a link that I could include in the show notes?
Yeah, if you, it's on spencercritchley.com.
Okay.
And it's also still at HuffPost. If
Great.
you Google A Letter to a Friend Who Voted for Trump, Spencer Critchley, I'm sure you'll find it. If you have any trouble, let me know. And
no, that's fine. I'll include the link in the show notes. So I'm curious, at this particular juncture in your story, maybe this is a kind of a rapid acceleration to closer to now. I don't know. There seems to be some kind of deeply destructive intent that has been pretty well concealed for most of the decades of my lifetime, but in the past couple of decades has become more and more visible. And I'm a little distracted, not just in this conversation, but in general. I'm tired of talking about Trump because he is clearly not the source of any of this. He is just our shadow, our representative shadow of what we collectively are begging for somehow or another.
The subtitle of my book is Why Trump Was Inevitable.
Yeah,
and what happens next. So yeah,
so
he didn't
I'm
cause
curious,
this. He's an expression of it.
I'm curious if we could just expand the conversation from the personality and figure of Trump to include the low-hanging fruit here is the other complicit Republicans who are backing everything, and they're just hungrily gobbling down all the control and all the power and all the gaslighting and all the remarkable corrosive elements that are showing up in spades in politics. This is not just kidding around. This is really corrosive and deeply destructive of what was already tenuous at best in any part of this amazing experiment in democracy since it started. I know that that's the kind of stuff you're talking about. And I just wanted to expand it beyond the personality Trump, because
Yeah.
I think he's not worthy of that much importance in the story. I'm concerned that the elements, just living here in Oregon, in addition to having some of the tremendous fires going on the whole West Coast, we have a whole lot of our population is reactionary and really getting into action
Mm-hmm.
with regard to, they're arming up, and they, no matter which way the election goes in November, they're ready to get going and be a presence that is to be dealt with from now on, no matter which way it goes. And so I'm curious if you can speak a little bit more to the specific elements that add up to that
Yeah.
are on top of things like, how we are the only major industrialized country in the world that doesn't have something along the lines of universal health care. We just don't like ourselves. We're ready to just whoop on each other. So
Yeah.
help me out here. Help me understand where this came from and how this is going.
Sure. And it's especially tragic given where we were with Obama, um, a short while ago. I'm a huge fan of Obama, as you might imagine, having worked on both of his campaigns, and
Yes.
became so much more of one through having been on those campaigns. I always tell people, however you feel about any one of his particular policies, I happen to line up with him pretty closely on the politics of this. And I'd love if we have a chance to get into the practicalities of politics,
Yeah.
because I know there are a lot of people who are further left who, are upset that he didn't get single payer healthcare, for example. And that's been part of my life's journey, has been a process of, I think, disillusionment, but also deeper understanding of how all of this stuff works, and how it inevitably works. And but I'll just sort of say in passing, Barack Obama is one of the finest people I've ever encountered under any circumstances in my life. We were, again, whether you love his policies, feel somewhere in the middle, or didn't like any of them,
Yeah.
we were lucky to have a person of that excellence in every sense as our president. Is just one of the most intelligent, principled, compassionate people I've ever seen, and that's the
Right.
way I think we all felt on the campaign. It's why he, frankly, attracted such good people at so many levels. Uh, who would have left that campaign. They weren't there. You don't work on one of those campaigns for the money. Well, you do if you're a Republican, uh, obviously. And there are some Democratic political hacks who are only in it for the money
Yeah.
as well. But nobody was there for the money. The money was terrible. And but just that. So just hopefully that's a little bit hopeful. As sad as it is now, where we are now, with all the just venality and greed and corruption, and I would say treason, that we're seeing now. A few short years ago, we had one of the greatest presidents in history, uh, just as a matter of his character and talent.
Great. I appreciate the balance that you're talking about, and hopefully we'll get to spend a bit more
Yeah.
time fleshing
Uh,
that.
the overall, how we got here, within the framework of my book, there have been a number of other as dark or more dark periods in our history and in world history, of course. Um, and I would say that they share a common theme. Human nature is contains terrible darkness, uh, along with light. And one of my views of human history is that we keep telling ourselves the story of good and evil, that there are some people who are bad and some people who are good, and we need to judge the bad ones and punish them. And if we catch ourselves being bad, we judge ourselves and punish ourselves. And it's a disintegrated form of awareness, I would say. I've come to learn, and I very much grew up in this tradition. I was raised in a very enlightened, liberal household. I had a very progressive father. He was a civil rights activist in the 1950s in Bermuda, which was roughly like being a civil rights activist in maybe Atlanta, Georgia, or somewhere back then. But also inherited the kind of, Western Judeo-Christian tradition of judgment and good and evil, and this sort of binary of good versus evil, and the unending struggle of good versus evil. And so much damage has been done by people of all descriptions by pursuing the demon and trying to kill the demon, finding it in other people. And in the context of our history, with this contest between these two worldviews, the counter-enlightenment and enlightenment worldviews, I'd say, if you look at the roots of the counter-enlightenment, some of them are beautiful. I mean, this is where art and poetry and spirituality and mystery and magic come from, is this mode. And yet, because it's not rational, and it invites you to surrender to the way things feel and to your intuitions, it's also the worldview of bigotry and hatred and superstition. And when it's exploited, the worst kind of ugliness. So a great example of this is Richard Wagner, who was a very counter-enlightenment figure in German history and culture, created some of history's most beautiful music and most accomplished art. He designed the idea of the Gesamtkunstwerk, the total work of art. He kind of single-handedly invented what opera is like, and really by extension, theater and movies. And his music is beautiful and just a titanic genius, and yet the most vicious anti-Semite, the most hateful person imaginable. And that's an example of the dark side of the counter-enlightenment. In our own history, if we look at the founding of the country on the backs of African slaves, this is another example of the terrible darkness that's in human nature and that is waiting there to be tapped if we surrender to it. At the founding, there were among the founders abolitionists, and who felt slavery was wrong, and the British had already gotten rid of it. But they kept it in the Constitution. And throughout the following history of the rest of the 18th century and throughout the 19th century, slavery was this live issue, and they were making these terrible compromises like the Missouri Compromise, the Great Compromise, the Fugitive Slave Act, in which people living in free states would hand over escaped slaves back to their slave masters. The assassination of Lincoln, his successor, Andrew Johnson, who was a terrible racist and reversed a lot of the progress made by Lincoln. And then the former slaveholders of the South set about undoing the emancipation and started incarcerating and lynching and torturing and murdering Black people. And, it's just awful what we did to the Native Americans, just taking their land and deliberately starving them to death by slaughtering all the buffalo. Chinese Exclusion Act, the exploitation of Chinese labor to build the railways, the internment of Japanese Americans, anti-Semitism, anti-gay violence, anti-everything, right? So it's very easy throughout all of this to say, well, the problem here is these damned right-wingers, or, it's white people, or it's Southerners. Or if you're on the other side, the problem is these hippies and these radicals and Antifa and these socialist Democrats who hate America, etc. It's all kind of the same thing. And one of the things that I've really been led to is to stop romanticizing human nature. One of the things I say, and we do a lot of work, my company, Boots Road Group, we specialize in doing communications consulting for people doing good in the world, essentially. We only take clients who are trying to make things better. And a lot of them are nonprofits, and we've also done a fair bit of political work, and we work with socially responsible corporations. But one of the things I've learned and that I often say is, if you want to love humanity, you're going to have to drastically lower your expectations. I think it's important to love humanity, but there's no point loving humanity based on a fairy tale. The darkness that we're seeing now was waiting there to be exploited by Trump and by the deeply corrupt Republican Congress and his hangers-on in his administration and some media outlets. But it's not, Trump didn't create it, as you say. And even though it's mostly Republicans who are doing this, and there is something very deeply wrong with the Republican Party right now, I would say. It's not because they're Republicans. It's not because they're any kind of person. It's not because they're white men. It's, just like, if a black person is a criminal, it's not because they're black. It's because it's human nature, and it's waiting there to be tapped, and it can be tapped in all of us, depending on the circumstances.
Yeah, again, thank you for that kind of filling in some of the gaps and including your layout of what you're seeing. I'm really curious because it seems like there's quite a bit of overlap with what you're describing, how you do your consulting work with various organizations, and it sounds like let me just see if there is as much weave as I think there is between the orientation of my work and perhaps yours. It seems like we're both talking about what is often called shadow, the Jungian notion of parts of ourselves that we deny or we repress or we don't want to believe about ourselves, to the degree we are unwilling to see those aspects of ourselves being people, those same people that we need to lower our expectations about. I'm one of those people. And so to the degree I'm unwilling to look at that part of my humanity is the degree to which that will somehow get expression. And it's not pretty when it comes out sideways like that. When it comes out in an unconscious fashion, what we get is pretty near identical to what we've got going on right now. So I'm wondering, does that seem like a similar framing, or do you have a different way of seeing it?
Yeah. In the book, I talk about the difference between Marx and Freud as a dichotomy that expresses that. And you can extend from from Freud to Jung. So Marx thought he had discovered the science of history. This is interesting because this is one of the roots of intolerance on our side of the political spectrum of liberals that we often overlook. We overlook this shadow side of ourselves, that there is a form of liberal intolerance and even authoritarianism that we often think we don't have. That's the other side that's like that. We're all about community, and helping each other and looking after the vulnerable, et cetera. But there is a form of liberal intolerance that's very serious and can get extremely dark. So, and I think the roots are in the Enlightenment gone mad. There are situations in history where the Enlightenment has gone mad and when the counter-Enlightenment has gone mad. The Enlightenment gone mad is when you're hyper-rational and you think rationality explains everything. And Marx thought he had discovered the science of history. This was a trend in German philosophy at the time. And if you think you've discovered the science of history, and therefore, science of politics and how government should be organized, you're on the road to deep intolerance, because anybody who disagrees with you is either wrong or corrupt, right? Those are the only choices. So they have to either be re-educated or stopped, probably through punishment, possibly through death. And the results of how people interpreted what Marx was saying, Marx, by the way, was also quite an anti-Semite. I'm afraid it was quite common back then. But the results are things like the Marxist-Leninist dictatorship in the Soviet Union and the other countries like Maoist China and Cambodia and other countries that followed suit, where in the interest of a theory of how society was supposed to work, horrible crimes were committed and unspeakable cruelties. You know, in the Soviet Union, tens of millions of peasants died. And a lot of that was because, starting with Lenin, they were trying to convert real world Russian peasants into theoretical Marxist-Leninist proletarians. And people literally died or were imprisoned or tortured in service of that hyper-rationalist, soulless, heartless ideal. The counter-enlightenment gone mad is Nazism, and which is an extremely hyper-romantic vision of national destiny, descended from what Wagner was talking about. Wagner in the Ring Cycle was attempting to express the soul of Germany, of the German people, and it begins with the Rhine maidens as an image of perfect innocence and joy, guarding the Rheingold, which is the gold of the nation of Germany, and is the essential sort of goodness and wealth and power of the German people. And what are they threatened by? The evil dwarf Alberic, who's a stereotypical Jew. So that's we see that strand throughout history, down to the present day in the United States, with the bigotry we see in the United States and people talking about "Make America Great Again," which is descended straight from that kind of vision of a pure state of national greatness that has to be recovered. But as you can see, there's just a great deal of darkness waiting there to be tapped. And I mentioned when I launched into this, the dichotomy of Marx versus Freud. So Marx is hyper-rationalist in my view, and his terrible mistake was thinking he had discovered a science of history. Freud came along later. I often wonder what would have happened if Marx had lived a little later and had met Freud, and would it have caused him to rethink things? Because Marx was also extremely naive about human nature. He thought that the reason people did bad things was because of private property. And if we just removed private property, and there are many liberals who still feel this way, this idea has not gone away. If we only didn't have capitalism and private property, people wouldn't be greedy and heartless and cruel to each other. That's an extremely naive view of human nature, in my view. Mm-hmm. And in fact, it's no more sophisticated or aware than any religious viewpoint. It is essentially, I would say, a religious statement of belief, not founded on any understanding of how human beings actually work. And Freud thought Marx was naive. And Freud understood, although he wasn't right about everything by any means, but he at least intuitively understood that we have these competing drives towards life and death, eros and thanatos. And thanatos, he didn't use that word, but referring to the death drive, which is the way he described it, that there's something in us that just wants to destroy and hate just for the sheer pleasure of it. And I think Freud was a lot closer to the truth. These horrible things we've seen in world history and in American history with slavery, these awful things we can point to, down to the present day with locking up little children in cages on the border. I think we have to understand that that's in us, and the extent to which we think we understand that problem by saying there's something evil about Trump supporters, for example, or there's something evil about Trump himself, I think we're missing the point. There's something evil in human nature, if we want to use that word evil, that we need to turn towards and recognize and understand, because if we keep casting it out of ourselves and saying it's only in those other people, we're just going to keep repeating this cycle.
Wow. There's a tremendous amount of overlap in your orientation and your consulting work and so on, and clearly in your book. And I can't wait to now dive in deep into your book. I really appreciate that layout. There's a tremendous amount of overlap between your framing that you've just spelled out and my own in developing this work. So there are a number of directions I was hoping to go in. I'm a little concerned. Time is flying by. And the only thing
this is so interesting. I appreciate as much time as you're able to give it. I really do appreciate your
Yeah,
willingness
well,
to
maybe we
dig
should,
in.
just look at booking another round in the near future, because I think there are deeper dimensions to go here. But the one thing that I just have to ask now, just to get some kind of sense of, because we both have this way of seeing that involves the human shadow and how deeply it is just a part of who we are. So, given we've both got that, and you're the one that's bold enough to say in your book that you might even have some suggestions how we could bridge that extraordinary gap between that kind of sober knowledge of that shadow and the possibility of integrating it in a good way, and the immense contrast between that possibility and how it's actually going today, they look miles apart. So can you help me out with any kind of a sense of how we can bridge that gap between
Sure.
what you're saying might be possible in terms of positive direction and the shadow that is really running the world at this point?
Sure. One thing I would say is we must engage with politics if we live in a democracy. As hard as that can be, and I used to, have that feeling about politics that it would be just dirty and grubby and full of, weasels. I got into it through a sense of civic obligation. I was really kind of holding my nose, and I was really struck, first of all, by how many genuinely good people I met, including my first clients. Our local member of Congress is just a wonderful person, became a mentor for me, and then Obama, just one of the greatest people I've ever met. But also such an eye-opening experience to understand how there is no escaping politics. Politics is going to go on whether you take part or not. And politics is how we negotiate power. And people pursue power. This is part of my own awakening. There's no way out of this in the near term that involves people not pursuing power. And if good people don't pay attention and get involved, then bad people do. And that's a large part of what we're experiencing now is those of us who were not paying attention and involved, left it open for people like not just Donald Trump, but the far smarter and more capable people who are amplifying his impact, people like the Attorney General, William Barr, for example, or the Republican caucus, or Lindsey Graham, or these people who are doing just an enormous amount of damage to the country. So that's part of it. The other part is in the final section of the book, and when I talk about what comes next, and again, it's Patriots of Two Nations, why Trump was inevitable. He was coming one way or the other, and what happens next. So what happens next is it's not going to get better even if he loses, and even if he does leave the White House. We will still be suffering like this. And it wouldn't have been better if Hillary had won. In some ways, it would have been as bad or worse because of all the anger on the other side.
Mm-hmm.
People like Joe Biden just have to win the election. And that's what, I learned how to do through working in politics. That's just very practical. We have to win this election without sacrificing our own principles. But it's just like we have to win this election so we can get power and stop bad things from happening and help good things happen. It's very much like a battle, really. But what the average person, I am convinced, needs to do is to do the work, especially on our side. Somebody has to start. And since I'm on the kind of enlightenment liberal side, I'm saying let's start on our side of using empathy and compassion and awareness to try to imagine how the world could look so different, how that people literally would define truth differently, where facts and logic don't necessarily define the truth. This is why Trump supporters don't really care how much evidence you present to them that he's a liar and he's corrupt and he's incompetent. They're pursuing what they see as a higher form of truth. And in their worldview, facts and logic look pretty small compared to faith and tradition and loyalty and rootedness in love of a land, not just a country as a concept, but the land that you sprang up out of.